They thought we were just another couple they could push around. The HOA slapped us with fines, harassment, and threats, determined to drive my pregnant wife out of our home. But what they didn't know was that they were picking a fight with the very man who held the ultimate power over their entire community. And when I made my move, their whole world collapsed overnight. Behind the scenes, while the HOA tightened its grip, the husband made strategic moves that would eventually level the playing field. To most, he appeared as nothing more than another frustrated resident. But in reality, he was sitting on a secret that would change everything. His carefully constructed plan wasn't one of confrontation, but of control. He had been quietly working in the background, accumulating the very power the HOA was so quick to abuse. It started years ago when the husband, along with a few trusted partners, had invested in the real estate that made up the community. Unbeknownst to the HOA board, he had purchased controlling interests in the land leases, including the key developments, that the HOA used to assert authority over its residents. He'd established his holding company as a silent stakeholder in the community's infrastructure. It was a long-term investment strategy, one that didn't necessarily make sense at the time until now. The HOA had been operating under the false assumption that their rules and regulations were unassailable, that they controlled the fate of every homeowner, including his family. They believed the husband was just another resident who would buckle under the pressure of their harassment. What they didn't know was that he had already become their biggest nightmare. While the HOA threw its weight around, the husband began laying the groundwork to expose their abuses. He meticulously documented every violation, every illegal fine. In every instance where the HOA had gone beyond its authority, he built a case that would destroy the foundation of their so-called power. But it wasn't just about retaliation. It was about holding them accountable for the way they treated the community's residents, and most importantly, his pregnant wife. The husband had also quietly engaged with legal professionals who specialized in HOA and property law. They started poring over the HOA's bylaws and operations, identifying cracks and inconsistencies in their practices. His legal team began to draft a suit that would not only dismantle the HOA's leadership, but also challenge the very foundation of their existence. He had taken all the right steps, gathering evidence, consulting experts, and laying the groundwork for a decisive blow that would make the HOA's abuses public knowledge. But there was more to his plan than just legal action. The real power came from the financial control he had over the HOA's operations. Through a complex series of purchases and investments, the husband owned significant portions of the community's commercial assets, including the shared amenities, the infrastructure contracts, and key residential plots. He knew that the HOA couldn't function without these resources. Without his influence, they were nothing. The husband's quiet strategy had been months, even years in the making. It was a long game, one that required patience and precision. But now, as the HOA continued its campaign of harassment, he was prepared to make his move. What the HOA didn't understand was that every time they issued a citation or threatened legal action, they were not just pushing a vulnerable family. They were pushing the very person who could expose their corruption and dismantle their authority. Each angry letter, every retaliatory fine, every unwarranted inspection only strengthened the husband's resolve. He knew that they were digging their own grave, but they were too blinded by their power to realize it. The husband's next step was critical. He needed to ensure that the HOA's leadership would be forced into a position where they could no longer avoid facing the consequences of their actions. He began making calls to people who had influence within the community. People who knew the truth about how the HOA had been running roughshod over homeowners for years. He tapped into his network of residents who had been quietly suffering at the hands of the HOA and began organizing them for what was to come. The more the HOA tightened its grip, the more the husband's network of allies grew, through the careful cultivation of trust and by revealing the truth to the residents. The husband started to build a coalition, a force that could rise up against the corrupt leadership of the HOA. He made it clear to the other homeowners that the HOA wasn't invincible, that it could be challenged, and that they had the power to take back control over their community. What the HOA board had assumed was a passive, law-abiding neighborhood had turned into an organized resistance. The final step in the husband's plan was the one that would shake the HOA to its core. With the evidence he had gathered and the legal groundwork in place, he prepared to reveal his full hand. At the next HOA meeting, he would not just show the board their abuses, he would expose their vulnerabilities and take away the one thing they valued most, their authority over the neighborhood. The husband knew that once he revealed the extent of his ownership, once he showed the HOA board that they no longer had the power they thought they held, everything would change. There would be no going back. The board had no idea what was coming. They had pushed too far, made too many threats, and crossed lines that would now cost them everything. The husband was no longer a passive victim in their eyes. He was the one who held the keys to their future, and he was about to use them. By now, the husband knew he couldn't rely on just being the wronged party anymore. The HOA had pushed too far, and it was time to make a stand, not only for his wife, but for every other homeowner who had been silently suffering under their tyranny. The first step in his strategy was to ensure the HOA's power was not just challenged, but completely dismantled. He started by documenting every infraction. No detail was too small. Cataloged every unjust fine, every threat, every demand that violated state or federal laws. From broken promises to illegal fees, he meticulously compiled records of the HOA's actions. Each violation was documented with dates, photographs, and written communications. The more he gathered, the clearer. It became that the HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. It was running an operation of intimidation and financial abuse. There was a pattern of overreach and unlawful behavior, and the husband intended to use it all to his advantage. Once the evidence was compiled, the next step was to consult with legal experts. He connected with lawyers who specialized in HOA, law, and property rights. People who understood the fine print of local regulations and were well-versed in taking down corrupt organizations. Together, they began to build an airtight case against the HOA. One that would expose not just the harassment, the broader issues of financial misconduct, power abuse, and unlawful practices. The legal team was confident if the husband wanted to take down the HOA, they could make it happen, but they would need to move quickly and strategically. With the case starting to take shape, the husband knew the HOA's actions weren't just a personal attack on his family. They were also damaging the entire community. He began reaching out to neighbors who had also been targeted by the HOA. Many were afraid to speak out, intimidated by the power the HOA wielded. But when they saw the documentation and the growing list of violations, many of them were willing to lend their voices to the cause. They were tired of being bullied and harassed, and with the husband's guidance, they began to form a unified front. It wasn't just about fighting back. It was about reclaiming their homes, their rights, and their dignity. While the legal and community aspects of his plan were moving forward, the husband knew that to truly bring the HOA to its knees, he had to hit them where it hurt the most, financially. He had already made strategic moves in the background to control a significant portion of the community's resources. But now it was time to cut off their funding sources. Many of the HOA's operations, including the property management services and maintenance contracts, were outsourced to companies that depended on the HOA for business. The husband began quietly contacting these companies, warning them of the impending legal action. He suggested they review their contracts and make sure they weren't exposed to any future liabilities by continuing to do business with an HOA that was under legal scrutiny. It didn't take long for some of these companies to distance themselves from the HOA, afraid of the legal fallout that could ensue. The financial hit was just the beginning. The husband started to turn the screws, applying subtle pressure on keyboard members. He knew some of them had financial stakes in the HOA's operations. Real estate investments, contracts, and deals that the public wasn't aware of. Using a mix of legal inquiries and indirect methods, he began to expose these connections, pushing them into a corner. The board members' confidence in their ability to control the situation began to crumble. They were no longer untouchable. They were under constant scrutiny, and the pressure was building. As the financial web unraveled, so did the HOA's credibility. The husband had laid the groundwork for a situation in which the HOA could not move forward with their threats or their fines without facing serious consequences. Any legal action they tried to take now had the potential to backfire. He wasn't just standing up for his family anymore. He was taking down an entire corrupt organization that had overstepped its bounds. The most satisfying part of the husband's plan was the way it exposed the HOA's false sense of authority. They had acted as if they were the ultimate power in the neighborhood, bullying homeowners into submission, abusing their position for personal gain, and ignoring the rights of those they were supposed to serve. But with every step the husband took, the cracks in the HOA's empire grew wider. The more evidence he uncovered, the more neighbors rallied behind him. The momentum was shifting. The HOA wasn't the almighty force it once believed it was. It was a house of cards ready to fall. At this point, the husband knew it was time to move in for the final strike. With the legal case coming together and the financial rug being pulled out from under the HOA, they would soon have no choice but to concede defeat. But he wasn't done yet. He still had one last ace up his sleeve: the revelation of his control over the neighborhood. When the HOA board learned that the very person they had tried to bully and intimidate had the power to shut them down with a few phone calls, the shock would be devastating. The humiliation would be complete. In that final moment, when the husband made his move, it would be the end of the HOA's reign of terror. They would learn that in their attempt to break his family, they had only set the stage for their own undoing. The final blow to the HOA was about to land, and the husband knew the time had come to strike decisively. After months of careful planning, building evidence, and securing alliances, he was finally ready to present the truth that would not only expose the HOA's corruption, but also dismantle their authority once and for all. The reveal of his ownership was the key, the piece of information that would render everything they had done meaningless. The HOA had called an emergency meeting. First, they believed they were simply dealing with another routine complaint, another resident they could bully into compliance. But this time, they were wrong. The husband had secured a seat at that very table. But instead of sitting there as just another disgruntled homeowner, he had arrived with a bombshell. A revelation that would shatter the facade of power the board had built over the years. Before the meeting even began, the board was confident. They believed they had all the control, that their arbitrary rules and threats would keep everyone in check. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The husband calmly walked into the room, his demeanor composed as if he were just another member of the community. But when he began to speak, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a typical HOA meeting. With quiet confidence, he started, laying out the facts. He began by detailing his extensive research into the HOA's bylaws and its financial records. With every sentence, he revealed how the HOA had been mismanaging funds, breaking rules, and abusing its power. But that was only the beginning. The husband then dropped the bombshell that would change everything. He owned a significant portion of the community's land leases and had controlling interests in the commercial and residential developments that the HOA depended on. He held the contracts for maintenance services, managed the amenities, and had financial control over the very services the HOA relied upon to function. One by one, he laid out the irrefutable proof. He presented documents that proved he had legally acquired ownership stakes in key infrastructure, showing how the HOA's leadership had ignored the reality of their situation. The husband's quiet investment in the community over the years had given him control over the most critical parts of the neighborhood. Parts that the HOA had assumed they controlled, but which were now entirely at his mercy. The shock among the board members was palpable. For years, they had been throwing their weight around, issuing fines, threatening eviction, and manipulating residents. They had believed themselves to be untouchable, that no one could challenge their authority. But now they found themselves at the mercy of the very person they had harassed and bullied for months. Their power, which had seemed so absolute, was a mirage. The husband didn't need to fight them with brute force. He simply had to show that the power they wielded didn't belong to them. It belonged to him. As he continued his presentation, the reality of their situation set in. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some attempted to deny the truth, but the evidence was overwhelming. Documents were concrete. The contracts were binding. They could no longer ignore the fact that they were operating in a system where they had no control over the very properties they were trying to dictate. In the midst of the chaos, the board members began to argue among themselves. Panic set in as they realized they were no longer in charge. The foundation of their power was collapsing before their eyes. A few of the more vocal members demanded to know how they could fix the situation, but the husband wasn't interested in negotiation. He had already given them the chance to do the right thing, but they had refused. Now it was time for consequences. Legal action was swiftly put on the table. The husband, in the presence of his legal team, made it clear that he was prepared to file lawsuits against every board member personally for their actions. The HOA's financial mismanagement, the abuse of power, the illegal fines, all of it was on the table now. The board was not just facing a disgruntled resident anymore. They were facing a coordinated legal onslaught that would tear apart everything they had built. Their leadership positions, which had once been so secure, were now in jeopardy. The meeting devolved into disarray. The board began to fracture. Its members, fearing the legal repercussions and the public fallout, began to resign on the spot. The president of the HOA, once a vocal figurehead, tried to salvage his reputation by offering to step down quietly, hoping to avoid further embarrassment. But the husband wasn't done. He made it clear that resignation wasn't enough. The damage had been done, and accountability would follow. With the pressure mounting, the final nails in the HOA's coffin were hammered in. The husband demanded an immediate restructuring of the HOA's leadership. The board had failed in their responsibilities to the community, and now they would face the consequences. The board members, who had been the most aggressive in their harassment, who had fueled the toxic environment, were now on the defensive. The husband's legal team, empowered by the mounting evidence, had them cornered. They had no choice but to step aside. Within hours, the HOA's leadership was in tatters. What had once been a powerful, domineering force in the community was now reduced to a fragmented shell of its former self. The board was gone. The power structure had crumbled, and the husband, who had once been the victim, was now the one in control. The shockwave rippled through the community. Residents who had been too afraid to speak out against the HOA's corruption now saw that change was possible. They rallied around the husband, seeing him not just as a fighter, but as someone who had taken down a corrupt regime and reclaimed control over their own homes. The husband had won, not with brute force, but with strategy, patience, and the unrelenting pursuit of justice. The HOA was no more, and in its place stood a community that had learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the power of knowledge, ownership, and the willingness to fight for what's right. With the collapse of the HOA's leadership, the neighborhood was left in a state of disarray. The sense of fear and tension that had pervaded the community for years began to fade, but there was still much work to be done. The husband knew that while the battle had been won, the real challenge lay in rebuilding the community and restoring trust among the residents. He couldn't afford to be complacent. The leadership vacuum left behind by the HOA's disbanding needed to be filled with a new form of governance, one that was transparent, accountable, and truly representative of the community's needs. He didn't want to just end the HOA's reign of terror. He wanted to create something better, something that would bring the residents together, not divide them. The first step was to set up a series of community meetings. These weren't going to be the typical HOA-style meetings where a small group of elites made decisions behind closed doors. This was going to be different. The husband, working with a trusted group of neighbors, invited every homeowner to participate. He wanted to hear their concerns, their ideas, and most importantly, their vision for the future. For once, the residents were in control. They were no longer passive observers to the decisions that affected their lives. They were active participants in shaping their own destinies. At the first meeting, there was palpable excitement in the air. People who had been too afraid to speak up for years now felt emboldened. They shared stories of how the HOA had wronged them, and for the first time in a long while, they felt heard. The husband listened intently, making notes, taking everything in. He knew that the key to moving forward was to create a system that worked for everyone, not just a few select individuals. The community needed a new structure, one that emphasized fairness and cooperation. The idea of a new governing body began to take shape. Instead of a handful of board members holding all the power, the community would be governed by a council, a group of residents chosen by their neighbors, not by an elite few. The council would be responsible for making decisions. That affected the neighborhood, but it would operate transparently with regular meetings open to all. The residents would have a direct say in how their community was run, and the council members would be held accountable for their actions. This new system was met with overwhelming support. The residents, once divided by fear and mistrust, now found common ground. They were united in their desire for a better future, a future where they could live in peace without the constant threat of oppressive rules and unfair fines. The husband, with his wealth of knowledge and leadership skills, was naturally called upon to help guide the transition. He didn't seek power for himself, simply wanted to ensure that the community had a voice and a fair system to govern itself. As the new council took shape, the husband worked tirelessly to ensure that the process was inclusive and fair. He helped create a set of guidelines for the council's operations, focusing on transparency, accountability, and respect for everyone's rights. The council would operate by a set of rules that had been agreed upon by the community, ensuring that no one person or group could dominate the decision-making process. This wasn't going to be another HOA. It was going to be a true democracy where the needs and desires of the residents were prioritized above all else. At the same time, the husband's wife, who had been under immense stress throughout the ordeal, was finally able to relax and focus on her pregnancy. The constant threats and worries that had plagued their lives for months were now behind them. The weight of the HOA's harassment had been lifted from their shoulders, and they could now look forward to the future with hope and optimism. As the months passed, she gave birth to a healthy baby, a moment of joy and relief for both of them. The family was finally able to enjoy the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. The transformation of the neighborhood was remarkable. Had once been a divided and fearful community, was now a thriving, united one. Neighbors who had once barely spoken to one another now worked together to improve their environment. Community events were organized, and residents began to take pride in their homes and their shared spaces. There was a sense of belonging that had been missing for years, and it was all thanks to the efforts of the husband and the support of the residents. The real heroes of the story were not the ones in power, but the everyday people who had stood up against injustice. The husband had been the catalyst, but it was the entire community that had come together to make the change possible. People who had once been afraid to speak out now found the courage to do so, and their collective voices had made all the difference. The sense of empowerment that permeated the neighborhood was palpable. For the first time in a long while, the residents could look out their windows and see a future filled with possibilities. The days of oppression and fear were behind them. In its place stood a community built on trust, respect, and a shared commitment to fairness. The husband's victory was not just about taking down the HOA. It was about creating a new beginning, a new chapter in the life of the neighborhood. And as the family settled into their new life, they knew one thing for certain. They had fought for something greater than just themselves. They had fought for the entire community. And in doing so, they had shown everyone what could be accomplished. When people came together and stood up for what was right, for more unbelievable neighborhood battles, make sure to subscribe to the HOA Stories.